Hi everyone, my name is Kira Kolhoff. The title of my presentation is From Silos to Systems, Compound Flood Training for Washington, Developing a Guide for Practitioners to Bridge the Gap Between Science and Preparedness. My partner organization is Washington Sea Grant, and let's get started. So first, let's talk about the background. I'm going to briefly explain compound flooding because you will hear that a lot during this presentation, and it's not a commonly spoken of situation. So basically, compound flooding happens when two or more flood drivers, such as heavy rainfall, river discharge, storm surge, or high tides, occur simultaneously, producing damage that far exceeds what any single driver could cause on its own. Washington State is particularly vulnerable to this situation. Our atmospheric rivers, rapidly melting mountain snowpack, complex river systems like the Chehalis and Skagit, and rising sea levels along our coast create conditions where these drivers regularly collide. In 2007 and again in 2009, that occurrence closed Interstate 5 in the Chehalis River Basin for multiple days. As climate change intensifies, events like these will only become more frequent. So that is why we're focusing on compound flooding. This diagram is how compound flooding works. It basically shows how storm surge and excess river flow can all interact to create a compound flood zone. Another main point in the background is that current flood planning frameworks only assess coastal hazards independently, meaning they only focus on one issue at a time, like tides or storm surge or excess rain, and emergency management systems remain institutionally fragmented. So this is a case study of Hurricane Florence, which happened in 2018 and was in North Carolina. This caused about $24 billion in damage, and 3.6 billion of that was due to the compound flooding impacts, which is about 15% of the total inundated area during the flooding situation. Um, Next, we have my research question, which was how can compound flood training frameworks improve preparedness across fragmented flood planning and emergency management systems in Washington State? So then for my internship, I conducted this with Washington Sea Grant, and we developed a compound flooding training guide for Washington State coastal practitioners to use. And so my methods mainly included compound flood research literature review, an analysis of flood government frameworks like FEMA's plans and FEMA's guidelines, review of practitioner training models, and then to make ultimately my guide design grounded in hazard communication. And to do this, I had interviews and meetings with other practitioners who kind of do hazard mitigation as their day-to-day to figure out how the best way to communicate hazard mitigation effectively. Next, we have the results. So the main findings from the literature review and the conversations I had was that single driver flood maps underestimate compound risk. And then institutional fragmentation limits preparedness for communities. And then finally, scenario-based training improves practitioner preparedness. And then the key literature finding that I want to highlight is that, again, institutional compartmentalization is the central structural barrier to effective compound flood preparedness. And then for solutions, we are saying basically that training strategies identified were compound trigger thresholds activating when multiple conditions converge, meaning that we should be triggering a compound warning when there are multiple of the flood factors at risk. And then using Cosmos mapping tool for local scale compound risk visualization. And Cosmos is a coastal storm modeling system that models extreme water scenarios like floods. Um, for example, they have a like 50-year flood map, things like that, that can be really useful to planners and practitioners. And then next is to utilize nature-based solutions as mitigation strategies, and then finally plain language and scenario-based community engagement tools. And then this is an example from my deliverable, which is basically just some examples of how compound flooding can occur in Washington State because my guide was made local to Washington State, and this can kind of be replicated for different areas and different locations as well. And then my main takeaway kind of just emphasizes again that the risk is obviously always underestimated because the flood drivers and government systems are all treated separately. And then next, we will go into the broader significance. So locally, Washington coastal communities face growing compound flood exposure. Existing single driver flood planning frameworks underestimate the risk. South Puget Sound and Southwest Washington face elevated vulnerability from sea level rise and land subsidence. And then cross-agency preparedness training can improve local emergency response coordination. And then globally, flooding challenges conventional hazard governance worldwide. Rural and indigenous communities are disproportionately vulnerable to fragmented flood planning systems. And then scenario-based training frameworks may be adaptable to other coastal regions. So the hope is that these types of trainings can eventually be expanded into other places. And then finally, for policy implications, I believe that incorporating compound flood frameworks into hazard mitigating planning would be really useful. Land use and infrastructure decisions should be using tools like Cosmos, compound flood mapping when deciding where things should be built and how things should be used. And then finally, integrating compound trigger thresholds into warning systems would be super important just for the overall safety of everyone. And I just want to thank Washington Sea Grant and all my site supervisors as well as my cohort peers. Um, and then thank you to my friends and family for listening to me talk about compound flooding. Thanks.